Chapter 15 of Clog Shop Chronicles by John Ackworth. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Zeal of Thine House 2. To be or not to be. The new super, whose attack on the Beckside Chapel has been recorded, was too wise a man to push his plans in the face of such determined opposition, and consequently abandoned the whole project. And it is only consistent with the nature of things that, when the minister had finally given up the idea, those who had so resolutely resisted began to see something in it. Jabe had poured scorn on the suggestion that the pews were not altogether what they ought to be, but somehow they never either looked or felt quite as cosy afterwards, and he caught himself very nearly admitting that they were deep and stiff-backed. Long Ben, who'd been so proud of the work of the painting and decorating committee which fettled up the chapel for Jimmy Juddy's wedding, presently became troubled with inward doubts as to whether the result justified the effort, and Sam Speck had to be severely reproved for expressing the treasonable wish that the chapel didn't look quite so much like the mill engine house. In proportion, however, as these doubts took root in their minds, each became more and more demonstrative in repelling attacks on the old building, and more emphatic in praising its many excellencies. At the same time, each man was conscious of an uneasy suspicion of the loyalty of his friends in the matter. To have heard the conversation as they stood outside and watched Silas lock up on Sunday evening, you would have thought that their admiration of the edifice was higher than ever, for whilst before the super's ill-starred proposal the chapel came in for occasional commendation or defence, just as circumstances required, now there scarcely ever passed a Sunday night but on their way to the Clog Shop parlour or home some one of the officials would be sure to turn round just where he could get a last glimpse of the building and say, " There isn't a comfortabler little chapel for 20 mile raand." All the same, a slow progress of disintegration was going on in the minds of these authorities, a process of which this excessive admiration was but too certain a sign. The fact was, the Becksiders had a great respect for the superintendent minister, whoever he might be, and the present one, the new chapel suggestion apart, was so popular with them all that unconsciously they had been deeply impressed by his opinion. The way also in which he had borne himself when opposed, and the good sense he had displayed in not resenting opposition, commended him strongly to their judgments, and one or two of them had gone so far as to secretly regret the part they had played in his recent defeat. Not that anyone ever spoke of the matter. The super regarded the question as closed, and apparently the officials did the same, but they were all nervously afraid of someone suddenly springing the question upon them again, and thus compelling them to avow their modified views. The lesser lights were particularly uncertain about Jabe. Judged by his utterances, there wasn't the slightest chance of a new chapel whilst he lived, but they were not quite sure, some of them, that his loud protestations were not a trifle overdone, and they were strengthened in their suspicions by the Clogger's very apparent admiration of the super. These feelings were deepened by the fact that Jabe announced to them one evening that the super had been an architect before he entered the ministry, and had built at least a score of places of worship in the course of his public life. Evidently, Jabe and the preacher had been talking of chapel building. One Sunday night a stray remark by that rash young man, Dr. Walmsley, gave Long Ben a long looked-for opportunity, and 5 men stopped in the middle of long pulls at their pipes and held their breaths, as Ben alluded for the first time openly to the forbidden subject in the presence of the minister. But the super knew his men by this time, and did not rise to the bait, and every listening smoker breathed a sigh of relief. When he had gone, and the company had settled down to the regular Sunday evening topic, and Lige had finished a highly flattering criticism of the sermon, Jabe once more brought all talk to a standstill, for, tilting back in his chair and balancing it on its back legs in sublime indifference to the subject under discussion, he said, apparently to a half-consumed ham hanging on the joist near the door —" If ever we do have a new chapel i' Beckside, yon's the mon as I should like to build it." There was a long silence. Not a word was said in reply, and when the conversation was resumed it was on the old topic of the evening's sermon. All the same, every man went away that night with the feeling that the new chapel was now at any rate a possibility. Next week was the Circuit Quarterly Meeting, and as usual Jabe, Long Ben, Nathan and Sam attended as the representatives of Beckside. Just before the meeting closed, the " super," with a palpably gratified air, announced that a very interesting communication was about to be made to the meeting, and called upon Brother Ramsden of Clough End. This gentleman, who was to Clough End what Jabe was to Beckside, and who had been for him unusually quiet all evening, with a look of immense importance, rose at the call of the chairman, and after justifying his reputation for jocularity by a number of more or less appropriate witticisms, formally asked the permission of the meeting to build a new chapel at Clough End. " An' Aw whoap," he concluded, " as it'll stir our Beckside friends up to get aat o' yond' owd barn o' theirs." All eyes were at once turned towards the Clogger and his friends, but Jabe closed his mouth very tightly, pursed his lips, and looked across the room into vacancy. And the others feeling, as Sam Speck afterwards admitted, " as if cowd wayter were runnin' daan my back," shot glances of quick inquiry at Jabe, and imitated his look of stern gravity, as if in rebuke of the frivolity of the speech to which they had just listened. The Clough Enders, who had to pass through Beckside on their way home, got into the coach with the Clogger and his friends, and were of course full of their new scheme. Soon they drew Long Ben, as a practical man, into the discussion of a draft plan of the proposed structure which they had brought with them. This was too much for Sam and Nathan, whose curiosity proved stronger than their dignity, but Jabe with folded arms sat bolt upright in the far corner of the vehicle, not deigning to notice the plans or show the slightest interest in the conversation. There was always a full attendance round the Clog Shop fire on the evening of the Quarterly Meeting, and on this occasion every possible seat was occupied, Jimmy Juddy, Sniggy Parkin, the doctor, and even retiring Ned Royle being there to hear the news. The air with which the Clogger walked through the shop into the parlour to change his Sunday coat announced more plainly than words that there was something unusual to tell, and the company present was preparing itself for a feast of succulent intelligence and discussion, when Sam Speck, who had stayed behind to say " Good neet " to the Clough Enders, suddenly burst into the shop and spoilt all by blurting out in excited eagerness —" Chaps, the Clough Enders is goin' to hev a new chapel." Instead of the sensation he expected, Sam received a decided snub. The news he brought was unwelcome, but his manner of serving it up was inexcusable. Matters of this kind were not to be flung at them as if they were mere items of ordinary gossip. And so, instead of looking at each other in amazement, as Sam had expected, they carefully avoided catching each other's eyes, and sat looking into the fire with a decidedly non-committal look on their faces. At this moment Jabe reappeared, and everybody felt that now the subject would receive becoming treatment. But first the Clogger held a consultation with his apprentice on some matter of business, and the company was divided between impatience to hear his story and admiration of his artistic sang froid. Then he sauntered idly to his seat by the fire and commenced to charge his pipe, attempting as he did so to start a discussion on the probable age of the vehicle in which he had just travelled. But nobody assisted him, though all admired his magnificent self-possession. The pipe duly lighted, he at length commenced his regular description of the events of the day, but he was most aggravatingly deliberate. Not a detail was omitted, though he must have seen with what impatience his needless elaboration was received. Then he diverged into a discussion with Sam Speck as to whether the average contribution per member from Brogden had been 1s. 4d. or 1s. 5d., and when the latter figure was eventually accepted, he branched off, for the special edification of Sniggy, into an exhaustive description of the financial system of averages which obtained in the circuit. The company listened with growing but carefully concealed impatience to this digression, marvelling uncharitably at Sniggy's lack of comprehension, and all looked relieved and hopeful when, with a long drawn " Well," Jabe prepared to resume the main current of his story. But just at that moment his pipe went out, and every man in the company watched with painful interest as, after trying 3 matches, he finally discovered that the fuel was exhausted, and proceeded with exasperating deliberateness to refill and relight it. As a rule, the members of the club were proud of the prodigious memory of their chief, but for once they could have wished it had been a little less tenacious and precise, for the speeches of the officials seemed long and tedious affairs indeed as Jabe reported them. At last, however, the statement for which everyone was waiting with a burning impatience could no longer be withheld, and so, propping himself against the shoulder of the inglenook, and drawing it out as if it were a hardship to have to give such an utterly unimportant detail, he said —" An' then Hallelujah Tommy says summat about a new chapil at Clough End, but I ne'er tak's mitch heed to wot that gaumless says." But nobody was deceived by this painful pretence of indifference, and in a moment or two Sam set every tongue wagging, and got rid himself of much pent-up excitement by crying —" Ay, an' it's to hev churchified windows and a pinnicle." Soon the discussion waxed hot, the interest being intensified by the fact that though they were only discussing the Clough End chapel, a far more important question was felt to be in the background. By long established custom the club sat an hour longer than usual on quarterly meeting nights, but though it was late when they began to separate, Long Ben, often one of the first to leave, lingered behind, and when he and the Clogger were alone and had sat for some minutes silently looking at the dying chip embers in the fire, he turned to Jabe and said with an anxious sigh —" Aw'm feart wee'st ha' ta give in, lad," and the sigh which accompanied the Clogger's reluctant " Ay " was longer drawn and deeper than Ben's. It was customary in the week of the quarterly meeting to hold a united fellowship meeting instead of the ordinary classes, and at such gatherings Silas, the chapel keeper, was generally a prominent figure. But the night after the events just described, Silas was dumb, and neither long pauses nor nods nor even nudges had any effect. " Th' dumb divil's gettin' howd o' some folk," said Jabe significantly, as he, Ben and Silas were passing along the side of the chapel homewards. But Silas only held his sharp sallow face a little higher, and gazed sideways at the rising moon. As they were turning the corner to the front of the chapel, however, Jabe pulled up, and whipping round at Silas in the rear, he demanded sternly —" Wot's up wi' thee ?"" Up !" shouted Silas, a look of fierce aggressiveness springing into his face. " Up !" he repeated, and seizing his companions by the arms, he pulled them back into the little graveyard and cried —" We're goin' to have a new chapel, Aw ye'r." " Well, what if we are ?" demanded Jabe. " Well, if there's a new chapel there'll be a — and Silas's voice became tremulant — there'll be a new chapel keeper, that's aw." The two leaders looked Silas over slowly from head to foot, with a mournfully curious look. " Dunna meyther thysel', lad," said Ben soothingly, as he put his hand gently on Silas's shoulder. " Meyther mysel' !" cried the chapel keeper, almost in a scream, and springing away from Ben's touch. " Aw've ta'n cur o' this chapil for welly 40 ye'r, and Aw'm th' poorest mon amung yo', but Aw've ne'er ta'n a brass fardin' o' wages aw th' toime. Wot have Aw done that for ? Wot have Aw lived i' th' little damp chapil haase for aw this time ?" The leaders moved uncomfortably, and had a guilty, self/reproachful look. " Dunna, Silas, dunna, lad," said Ben in a mournful, coaxing tone. " Dunna !" shouted the agitated apparitor, and pointing to a grave close under the chapel wall, he continued in high protesting tones —" Sithi, my owd muther lies theer, an' aar Kitty, an' little Laban, an' yond" — pointing across towards the boundary wall —" yond' lies my own bonny Grace an' her little un. An'," he continued, wheeling round, " here's thy fayther, Jabe, as poo'd me aat th' Beck when Aw wur draandin', an' theer's owd Juddy as poo'd me aat th' horrible pit an' th' miry clay. Ay," he went on, standing up and wildly waving his hands around him, " they're aw here, an' Aw live wi' them an' they live wi' me, an' when Aw feels lonesome an' daan i' th' maath, Aw comes aat here an' sits me daan an' sings aw by mysel', ' Come, let us jine our friends above that have obtained the prize.' An' Aw'st ne'er leave 'em. Aw'st ne'er leave 'em till Aw goa an' see 'em gradely." And out of breath with his exertion and excitement, the poor chapel keeper sank back and propped himself against a gravestone. By this time Ben was in tears, and Jabe, trying ineffectually to swallow something, looked first at one grave Silas had pointed out, and then at another, with a miserable convicted look on his face, and certain strange twitches about his mouth. " We met poo' it down and rebuild it, tha knows," suggested Ben hesitatingly from behind his pocket handkerchief. " Ay, for sure," chimed in Jabe. " Poo' it daan !" cried Silas in new agitation. " That's wuss nor aw. Sithee, Jabe, Aw'll show thee summat as tha's ne'er seen afore. Aw nobbut fun it aat mysel' t'other day." And taking Jabe by the elbow, he led him forward to where, close to the ground in a dark corner, all green and mouldy, was a stone in the wall. Then he plucked a handful of grass and briskly rubbed the face of the stone, and then, striking a match and holding it near the stone, he made Jabe kneel down and examine it, pointing as he did so to certain indistinct marks on the face of the stone. " Conna read it ?" he queried eagerly, but Jabe did not answer, but, kneeling on the grass, he kept looking carefully at the scratches until they slowly formed themselves into a scrawling legend, evidently made by the point of some sharp instrument —" Ebenezer John Longworth." Jabe continued to scrutinise the inscription, which was very faint, and had evidently been hastily done, until Ben came and knelt at his side and assisted in the work of decipherment. " It's reet," said Silas, when at length they rose to their feet. " It's just like his writing in the burying book." The three men stood looking down at the stone, and presently Silas resumed —" Naa, that's it. Thy fayther 'ud nobbut be a lad when he put that in, just convarted, Aw reckon, an' tha talks o' pooin' it daan, does tha ? An'," throwing open a window as he spoke, " yon's th' owd poopit as Adam Clarke preached in, an' Sammy Bradburn. Aw reckon tha'll poo' that daan. An' yon's th' penitent form (communion rail) where thee an' me an' summat's up aboon fan peace i' th' great revival. Tha'll be pooin' that daan, will ta ? Well, yo' con dew as yo'n a mind, but t' owd Book says, ' Thy servant shall take pleasure in her stones and favour the dust thereof.' An' Aw do, Aw do." And leaning his dark face against the old wall caressingly, as a child to its parent, he concluded —" Aw love every stooan in it, ay, an' th' varry dust we're treddin' on." Deeply moved by what they had heard, the two leaders somewhat hastily bade Silas good neet, and as they were going down the " broo," each turned round and took a long lingering look at the edifice they had just been discussing, sighing heavily the while. And that same week, without any spoken word having been used, but by such processes as were perfectly understood amongst them, it penetrated into the minds of the Beckside Methodists that whatever else was done, there would be no new chapel. Chapter 16